Okay, so once we have our very basic base form ready to go here, we are ready to start sculpting on this. Now, I discussed a little bit in the last video why I am largely going to be using sculpting for this is because it is mostly organic curved forms here, and this type of asset really lends itself well to sculpting. So there's a couple things we need to do in order to be ready to sculpt on this mesh in Blender. And the first thing we need to do is we need to apply our mirror modifier. Now, the mirror modifier will not work with the type of sculpting we're going to do early on, so we need to make sure that we apply it so that we save this half of the mesh. So to apply the mirror modifier, let's come into edit mode by pressing tab on our keyboard. Let's come into object mode by pressing tab on our keyboard. We were in edit mode previously. And let's just click this drop down and hit apply. So now if we tab back into edit mode, we see we have both sides of our mesh here. Okay, so for the actual sculpting portion, we need to first come into sculpting mode in Blender. To access sculpting mode in Blender, we just need to come up to the mode drop-down list and choose sculpting mode. Now you'll see that your toolbar on the left side of the screen changes when we enter sculpting mode. And these icons here all represent different brushes that we can sculpt on our mesh with. Now, one quick side note I do want to make is that I will be using a tablet to perform all my sculpting operations, which means I can, with a special pen, draw directly onto my screen here. Now, all of this that I'm going to show you can be accomplished with the mouse and keyboard. It's just a little bit more difficult. You will have a little bit less fine control, and you will have to pay more close attention to manually setting these settings up here for radius and strength. Whereas I have these icons on the right side of these settings enabled, which means I can use the pressure that I'm placing on my tablet to determine these values here. So if we were to come in and start sculpting on our mesh as it is, well, we can see that we are pulling some verts out here, but we really do not have enough geometry to sculpt in any meaningful way. So the way that we are going to go about this first stage of sculpting is to use what is called dynamic topology. Now, dynamic topology is used largely in the early stages of sculpting for creating the basic forms. To enable dynamic topology, all we have to do is come up to the top right-hand corner of the screen and enable this checkbox here. Now, we'll get a little warning that says we have vertex data and that our UVs will not be preserved. That's totally okay, just ignore this for now and press OK. So what dynamic topology does is it dynamically subdivides your mesh under your brush stroke as you sculpt. So if I were just to take this default draw brush, this top brush in the toolbar here, and begin sculpting, you can see that our mesh is now being dynamically subdivided, right? All of these are individual edges that it has created under our brush stroke. Now, because of the way dynamic topology works, it does not respect our underlying topology, which means it will create a sort of dense triangulated mesh under our brush strokes here. So having a dynamically topologized mesh here is really great for getting your basic forms, but if you needed to like animate this face per se, you would want to come in and retopologize it, and we will discuss how to do that later on in the course. Now, also another thing to notice about dynamic topology is that if you leave sculpt mode and return to it, it will disable dynamic topology. So every time you re-enter sculpt mode, all we have to do is click this checkbox again and ignore the warning. So I'm gonna Control Z to just undo those changes because I want to start fresh on this. And the last setting I need to enable before I really get sculpting is I need to enable symmetry on this. Now, We applied the mirror modifier already because dynamic topology does not work with a mirror modifier. We need to use the symmetry that is sort of packed into the sculpt mode of Blender for this to work properly. So symmetry is located up here, right next to the dynamic topology options, and it's represented by this little butterfly icon. So we want to mirror across the x-axis here. So we just need to hit this X right here to mirror across the X-axis, and you can see when I draw on it now, it will be perfectly symmetrical. So sculpting, again, as I said, is a much more artistic method of creating assets as opposed to modeling, which is a little bit more mathematical. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sculpting this head, and I will try to discuss what brushes and things I'm using as I am using them. So, as I said, we're using dynamic topology to get the basic forms. So let's just start drawing those in using the draw brush, which is this first brush here, and it will give you just sort of a basic drawing mechanic. Now, whenever you make a stroke in sculpt mode, for the most part, for most brushes, you will be pushing the vertices out. Now, if you want to push these vertices in instead, so if I wanted to, let's say, build up this form right here, which represents this little forehead piece, I would just start drawing with my draw brush in that area. Now, if I wanted to push this area for the eye socket in, to do that, I could do that still with the draw brush, but I just want to hold control while I make my strokes to push it in. So with that in mind, let's just go ahead and start sculpting these forms in. Now, typically when you're sculpting, you want to start with your large forms. It's sort of the same rule as drawing. You want to start with your large forms to get your basic shapes down before you begin putting in any sort of detail. So I'm just going to mark out roughly the areas I want for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and we will incrementally add a detail to it. Now, you may notice that while I am sculpting with dynamic topology in its default settings, if I zoom in very close here and I sculpt, we're getting a much finer level of subdivision than if I zoom farther out and sculpt here. You'll see that the edges that we're creating are much longer. This is because by default, dynamic topology is on a setting called relative detail. Now, you can see all the dynamic topology settings by clicking the drop down here. We have our detail size, our refine method, and our detailing mode. So what is causing the discrepancy here in the level of subdivision is this relative detail. Now, this is meant as an aid so that you work farther out when you are first building up your forms, and as you start to refine it, you move it back in. However, you can change this manually if you prefer. If you need a finer level of control, we can change this from relative detail to constant detail. Now, this will change the units up here for the detail size, but it will be constant no matter how close or far away I am from the mesh. So if with a detail size of 3 on constant, if I sculpt here, you'll see we get quite large resolution. And if I zoom out, it is just the same. So I'm going to put this back on relative detail for now. And if you want to use relative detail, but you just want the detail size to be finer, all you have to do is to adjust this detail size level right here. By default, it is at 12. So if I wanted less detail, I believe it would be something like 30. Going up would give you a sort of a lower resolution stroke, and bringing it down to something like 5 would be good for finer details. You can see we're getting a much smoother result here. So I'm going to put it at 10 to start out with, and I'm going to leave it on relative detail, and I'm also going to leave it on subdivide collapse. Now, what subdivide collapse does is it handles how we are subdividing this mesh dynamically. So basically what subdivide collapse does is that if a edge is over this detail size, it will subdivide it, and if it is too small, it will collapse it, so that we're maintaining more or less constant detail throughout. Now, there are some limits to subdivide collapse. If you're trying to get in like these really tight creases here, you will only be able to get the crease so tight before the edges start collapsing into each other. Now, the collapse function is meant to save on performance, so I don't suggest doing this early on, but when we are ready to do these tighter creases, we're going to come in here and just change it to subdivide. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started with actually sculpting more of this mesh, and we will discuss further some of these functions as they come up. So again, I'm just going to roughly block out where I want these main facial features. And again, I'm just using my draw brush. So to smooth out these edges, these sort of jagged edges the way I just did, all we have to do is with any brush selected, this will work for any brush, you just want to hold the shift key as you move over it to smooth. Now you want to be a little bit careful with the smooth brush, as that can easily and quickly erase a lot of the details you've put in, but it's also great for obviously smoothing out these more jagged areas. So I'm gonna push in with the control key and the draw brush here to form more of an eye socket, and we're gonna build up the forms of the eye back into it later on. So we're just kind of working with the skull here and the bone structure. So the more you know about sort of anatomy for artists, typically the better your character sculpting and face sculpting is going to be. So with this particular case, we have a little bit more freedom because, again, this is not an actual character. It is a stone sculpture of a head. But typically when drawing or sculpting, you want to start by sculpting in the basic bone formations and the planes of the face, and then building up the sort of what would be the muscle mass on top of that. So once you start sculpting in some of these basic forms, you're going to need to change your brush size eventually. So there's a couple of ways to do that in Blender. The first way would be just to come up to the top here where it says radius. Pulling the slider up or down will change the radius of your brush. However, this one I do not find particularly useful because you cannot see the preview of your brush as you are moving the slider up and down. You can also click on it and type in a value numerically if you need the number to be exact. However, I find it much more useful for large scale changes. You can press the F key on your keyboard and slide your mouse back and forth. Will give you a preview of the size of your cursor. So if I wanted something smaller, I could press F and then click, and I would now have a much smaller brush to work with for finer detail. If you only need to increase or decrease the size of your brush by a little bit, you can press the up bracket or the closing bracket on your keyboard, or the to increase your size, and the opening bracket to decrease your size. And if you are familiar with Photoshop, these are the same hotkeys that are used to increase and decrease your brush size in that program. So I'm just going to continue this by giving everything a really light tap with my pen here, just to increase the geometry that we're working with. And I need to bring this chin forward, so let's add some mass here. And Again, if you just need more geometry to work with, but you don't want to change the shape, you can either just lightly tap with the draw brush, or the inflate brush is also very good for this. So a few options down here in the brush palette, there is the inflate brush. And again, a really light tap here will subdivide your geometry, if you're using dynamic topology, of course, without changing the shape too dramatically. So I'm just using a combination of the inflate and the smooth brush here to up-res my model a little bit, so I have a little bit more geometry to work with. Okay, so I'm noticing there's a more dramatic slope in the forehead than I would really like here. So what I'm going to use to fix that is called the grab brush. Now you can access the grab brush with the shortcut G on your keyboard, and you'll notice that it highlights the grab brush here in the tool palette, which you of course can always just select from this menu as well. I'm going to increase the size of this to be quite large, and then I'm going to just grab I'm going to grab the forehead right here and move it out. Now for the grab brush, I like to use my mouse. I find it to be a little bit more exact than using a tablet if you are using one. Okay. So this is sort of the next most basic level after our base modeling here. So let's continue to go in and refine this. And I'm going to just keep using the draw brush. I find the draw brush to be the most versatile brush in your palette here. It just kind of works the way you would expect it, you know, a draw brush to work. You can just draw and it will raise up. We'll get into using more brushes as we continue to refine, but for this level of detail, I really find the draw and the inflate brushes to work the best. Of course, we're alternating with the smooth brush here to sort of equalize some of these lumps that are sort of a natural byproduct of sculpting at this level. So I'm starting to form some of the eyelids here. I think we can start to pull out some of the actual form for the eye. So let's zoom in a little bit to get a little bit more fine detail. And I'm actually going to use the inflate brush right in here to pull this form out. So I'm just going to switch to the inflate brush by selecting it over here. The shortcut for the inflate brush can also, the shortcut for the inflate brush is the I key on your keyboard, so you can also access it that way. I'm going to increase the strength here, so I'm noticing it's just not inflating as much as I would like. So to increase the strength, you can either come up to the slider here and slide it up. Of course, you can manually type in the value. Strength is going to always be between a value of 0 and 1. Or we can come in and press Shift F on our keyboard, and you'll get this sort of slider here, and you can select your strength that way. So it was at 0.5, so I want to increase it to, let's say, 0.8. Decrease the size a little, and you'll see that it's much quicker to sculpt in this eye form now. Okay, so we're getting sort of good forms in, but they're getting a little blurry right here as I sculpt. So I'm going to switch to what is called the crease brush to draw in some of these folds here, like such as these eyelid folds and things like right here, these any wrinkles. That is best accomplished with a crease brush. So we can access the crease brush by pressing Shift and C on our keyboard, and you'll see that the crease brush is right here on the tool palette as well. So this will sort of push in and pinch together your mesh to form more of a line here, and it's really good for differentiating forms. So I want this to be pretty heavily creased, and we can start to pull out some of these nose features a little bit more clearly. And again, now I'm not going for a one-to-one recreation of this image. This is more of an inspiration and a general guideline. So we're gonna maybe make it a little bit more cartoony, change the expression on the face, things like that. So we can start to pull in the mouth form as well. Not really too worried about getting this crease really tight right now. I'm just sort of drawing in these lines as a suggestion of where these features are going to be. And then I will continue to pull them in as I continue to refine. I want these sort of lines to form like these jowls right here. Pretty good. So I'm going to sketch out the ear next, and I'm going to do that with the draw brush again. So I'm just going to come up and select the draw brush. Sorry, the draw brush. And I had accidentally selected the draw sharp brush, which is another useful brush here. It works relatively the same as the draw brush. I think by default it is set to the negative, so that it pushes in like the crease brush, but it's a little less tight of a form. So you could hold Control to push it out instead, or if you want to switch the default direction of your brush, right here next to the strength we have this plus and minus key. So if it's on plus, that means by default the brush will push outwards away from your mesh when you draw on it, and that holding Control will give you the opposite of whatever sign is selected here. So if you find that you're holding Control the entire time and you just want to switch the direction of the brush by default, you can do so right up here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the draw brush right here, and I am going to just draw in this sort of ear form. Again, not really sculpting in the full form, just putting in the lines to suggest where the form is going to be. Okay. So this is already shaping up pretty well. The Olmec heads in all the references I've seen, they're all wearing these sort of helmets with these sort of front ear flaps. So let's go ahead and draw in the lines for that. So I'm just going to come across the forehead here with the draw brush and really just eyeballing it. I might even reduce my detail size to, let's say, 7 pixels, so that I can still be zoomed out to see the overall sort of arc of this line, but I still get a good, clear definition between the side of the head and this sort of helmet hat thing. Okay. So I'm just going to bring a little bit of form out around the ear here. And I'm using the shift key to smooth out any lumps. So I have sort of this lip here, but obviously I want this helmet to be a little bit more smooth. So I'm going to come in just above it with a combination of the draw and smooth brushes. I'm just going to fill this out so it looks a little bit less strange. And if you find that your sculptures are looking quite lumpy, that usually means your detail size is too small. So you either need to increase that here or zoom out. Typically going to a larger detail size and drawing the forms and then smoothing them will give you a better result than trying to put too much detail in right away. You'll often end up with a lumpy mesh. Okay, so I'm gonna switch to the crease brush and draw in the line here. So I just get a little bit more separation between the head and the hat or helmet. I'm not really sure what it is exactly supposed to be, but it's in the picture, so we're gonna put it in. So I'm sort of losing the shape here in the back, so I'm going to switch to the grab brush by pressing G, and I'm going to press F and increase the size on this just so I can pull this up to be a little bit smoother on the side here. And when you're sculpting, it's important that you look at your sculpture from many angles. In order, because you might have, if you sculpt, entirely from this angle, this side might look really good, but when you switch it around, it may look terrible. That's the other reason you want to always be sculpting in perspective mode as well. Unless the actual game you are creating your asset for is not in perspective, like if it's maybe like a top-down isometric, you should always be sculpting in perspective mode, because too often you get people that sculpt in orthographic view, which is what I've just switched to right now by pressing 5 on the keyboard. And they will sculpt it until it looks good in orthographic view, and then once it gets put in perspective, it will become very distorted. So double check to make sure that you're always in perspective when sculpting for 3D games that will be viewed in perspective. You always want to keep your target platform in mind. Because there's just no point to creating something, if it's not going to look good in the target platform. You can make it look very, very nice in Blender, but if it doesn't look good in Unreal, well, you've just wasted your time, really, because that's where this is eventually going to end up. Okay, I think I want to bring the sides of the head in to be a little bit more narrow. So I'm just going to use the grab brush again with a very large brush size. Yeah, that looks a little bit better to me. Okay, so we have actually a pretty solid basic facial features in now. I'm pretty happy with where it's at. So we're at about 30 minutes, so I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue to refine the sculpture. Okay, so we are back with part 2 of sculpting our Olmec head here. So I think that I'm ready for the sort of next level of detail. I think I have accomplished all that I am going to at this level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the dynamic topology settings, and I'm going to change this from 7, I should say, to 5. And I'm just going to slowly inch this down finer and finer. I'm going to leave it at subdivide collapse for the moment because I'm just not quite ready to take it even farther. Putting it on subdivide alone will make it an even lower level of detail. But you can see already just from switching from 7 to 5 and coming in and zooming in a little bit more, we're getting a much finer level of detail here. So I'm just going to come in and pull in these forms that I couldn't get at that higher level, or I should say that lower level of detail. It's a little bit confusing because the lower the numbers go, the higher your level of detail. So I apologize if I misspeak at any point there, but I think you get the idea. And again, I'm just using the draw brush here, a combination of the draw and smooth brushes to accomplish pretty much everything at this point. And then don't forget, if you press Control and use the draw brush, you can push in to get even more definition of these forms. I'm going to use the crease brush to go around the outer edge of this. So I'm going to press Shift and C. I'm going to zoom in so I can get a nice tight crease. I'm just going to go around the edge here. And then I'm just going to smooth on the very outer edge of this. If you smooth too closely, you will obviously start erasing that crease you just made. But if we just hover over here so that it's just the very edge of the brush that is near the crease, we can smooth out sort of some of these lumps. And I'm just going to come in with the crease and pinch the inner spiral here. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the draw brush by pressing X on the keyboard. X would be the shortcut for the draw brush. If you ever want to know what the shortcuts are, you can just hover over the brush in the tool palette here and it will tell you the shortcut if it has one. Not every brush has a shortcut by default. You can assign them manually yourself by coming into your preferences and binding them to the keys, but we're just going to stick with the default for the sake of simplicity. Any brushes that don't have a shortcut by default, typically they're just ones that you don't use very often, or just most people do not use them quite as often, so we can just select them manually from the toolbar. And again, don't worry about getting your creases too tight at this point. It actually would not be possible to do this, to get very, very tight creases at this point. So don't stress too much about getting like your eyelids in or these crease lines. Get them a little bit more refined and then we'll come back and get them really, really tight later. Okay, so I'm going to come in with the draw brush once more, and I'm going to zoom in on the eye so I can get more detail in here. And I'm just going to come in with a combination of the draw. I'm sweeping once over the eyelid with the draw brush to subdivide my geometry, and then I'm coming in with the smooth to smooth it out. And the smooth, again, just as a reminder, is any brush. You can just hold Shift and it will change that to the smooth brush while Shift is being held down. Just going to smooth out this eye, and then I'm going to switch to the inflate brush by pressing I. I'm going to increase this a little bit, and I'm just going to try to even out some of the lumps on this eye. Okay, now I'm looking at my eyes here, and they're nice eyes, but they don't really conform to the shape of these this reference image. And now this is totally up to you how closely you want to stick to your reference. I'm going for a pretty loose interpretation here, but if I did want to match this more closely, the way I would go about changing the shape of something like this is with the grab brush. Again, you can just use the grab brush with a fairly large brush size, and we can just pull around on our mesh until we have something in a shape that is more fitting. So I think I want to pull them out a little bit, decrease the size, no, not that much, pull them up to get more of this sort of half moon shape going here. I also think the eyeballs themselves are coming out a little bit too far, so I'm going to reduce the size of my brush, and I'm just going to push it in using the smooth brush here. Now, the nice thing about sculpting with symmetry, as opposed to modeling with symmetry, is that I can sculpt on either side. So when we were modeling, we really only had the right side to work with, and everything that we did on the right was copied over to the left. However, in sculpting, because we are using a different sort of symmetry here, what we can do is we can come in and sculpt on either side here, and no matter where we sculpt, it's going to be mirrored over to the other side. So if I was sculpting here and I noticed, well, I have a little bit better of an idea about these eyes from this angle for the left eye, well, I can come in and just edit the left eye directly, and then that change will be automatically mirrored over to the right. So that's one really nice thing about this form of symmetry here. I'm going to flatten the nose a little bit more using the grab brush. And I think it's time to add a little bit more detail to the nose itself. So let's switch back to our draw brush by pressing X and zooming in, adjusting our size here. And then just with the draw and the smooth, it's sort of in an alternating fashion, I'm just going to come in here and add a little detail. And switch back to the grab and push it in. And I want this sort of brow to form a different shape here. When you're talking about organic shapes, sometimes it's hard to describe what you're doing because nothing really conforms to a specific, like, primitive shape the way it does in modeling. But I'll do my best here. I want to give this guy sort of an angrier expression than we have in our reference image, because of course we have to keep in mind what this is for. Now this is our falling block, sort of big stone head that's going to fall on our character, so it's sort of like an enemy in its own right. So I'm going to give it sort of an angry expression. Switch to my grab brush and pull this down. I'm going to pull the brow closer to the eye itself, at least on the inner corner. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, so let's continue detailing here. I'm going to switch to the inflate brush to add a little bit of complexity and geometry to the nose. So I'm using just the inflate and the smooth. Inflate to subdivide, smooth to smooth it down. So for the nostrils, I'm going to reduce the size of my brush here, and I'm going to keep it on the inflate brush, and I'm just going to hold control and push it in. Now, if you're wondering what the difference between the inflate and the draw brush is, it's pretty slight. I can show you sort of on the back of the head here. The draw brush is going to push up sort of in one direction away from the mesh, and the inflate brush pushes out in all directions, so you get this much wider effect. I'm going to switch back to draw for this part, for the mouth. So it looks like I didn't leave quite enough room for these upper lips, but that's okay. I'm just going to sort of draw over my previous crease with the draw brush to get something closer to the volume that I'm looking for. And obviously these lips are sticking out way too much, so I'm gonna smooth them down with the smooth brush. And come back in for the bottom here. And I'm going to come in with the crease brush now. And I find the crease brush is most effective with a pretty small brush size. So I'm going to have to reduce the size of this here and come in and start to redraw the actual crease for the mouth. And it looks pretty decent from the front here, but obviously from the side, this is all wrong. So I'm going to use the grab brush, sort of in the opposite fashion of the crease brush. I find the grab brush works best with fairly large brush sizes. And I'm just using the smooth here to push this back into the face a little bit more. You can kind of think of your smooth tool as like your eraser. Okay, I'm going to pull out some more mask for the chin here. Just using the draw brush again. Actually, I think I want this mouth a little wider and a little lower. And then I'm going to sort of equalize out some of this chin area so it's a little bit less pointy. And I think the mouth is in fact protruding too much from the face. So what we can do here is sort of come in at a glancing angle with the grab brush and move everything in. Okay, so I'm really liking this form I have for the brow, but I want to change the shape of the nose here. And I want to be able to grab this nose without really affecting the brow here. So the way I'm going to do that is by using a mask. So the mask brush can be found sort of towards the bottom of your brush palette here. It's this little one with the paintbrush. So we can just click on this and that will pull up our mask brush. So what I can do now is I can paint on the area that I do not want to be affected here, and it will start to paint it in black. And this is going to be your mask. Now, a mask is sort of a temporary block, if you will. So I'm painting this all in black. Now, this will not affect the color of my final piece. It is just telling Blender basically by giving it values between 0 and 1, 0 of course being black, 1 being white, where I want my next brush strokes to be effective. So I've painted out my eye mask here because I don't want to change anything about this. So now if I come in with my grab brush here and I start to pull in the nose, you can see I can get much finer control over what I'm doing by masking out certain portions. So masking is extremely useful in sculpting, and I personally feel that you just can't get really high quality sculpts without learning how to use masks properly. Switch back to my inflate brush here and sort of continue to get the shape here in the nostril. So I'm holding control and pushing in, but then what I'm going to do after that is reduce my size a little bit more and then letting go of control so I have the normal inflate. I'm going to come around the edges to sort of tighten this up and add a little bit of volume in, I guess flesh. It doesn't really feel right to say that because this is a stone sculpture, but I think you get the idea. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so once you're done and you feel like you don't want this masked anymore, let's say I wanted to come in and make changes to the eyes now, we need to clear this mask away. So the fastest way to do that is by just clearing the entire mask. So we can either come up to here under the mask tab, and we can there's a lot of things you can do. Like if you wanted to only affect the eyes, you could invert it. So now everything else is masked out and I can only affect the eyes. But what I'm actually going to do is clear it, and you can see the shortcut for clearing your mask here is Alt-M, and that will just return everything back to the way it was. Okay, so I'm still coming in here with the draw brush and the smooth, and sort of alternating the smooth, the draw, and the crease to get this form here. Another thing to note is that this is really just the first stage of sculpting, and I'm just trying to get in the basic form. So I'm not going to be worrying too much about creasing these really, really tightly or doing any of this stone texturing. That's all going to come at a later stage after we've retopologized this mesh. So if you want to sort of pull up a line, sort of a sharp line that's distinct and coming away from your mesh, you can use the crease brush and hold Control for the opposite direction. So when I like to draw really well-defined lines, I like to hold Control and come in with the crease brush to push these out. And then of course we can release Control to push back in. And I need to change the shape of this mouth a little bit. This part is far too forward, so I'm going to come in with my grab brush and increase the size and just pull this out. Push this in. And maybe pull these cheeks more down towards the mouth itself. I just pressed M on my keyboard to get the mask brush back because I don't want to affect the mouth itself. I just want to affect this area. And of course the mask brush, the shortcuts work the exact same way as they do for the regular sculpting brushes. So with the mask brush, I can come in and paint, and then if I hold Control, it will erase any area that you need to erase with the mask. So I can sort of mask out the nose and mouth, and then I can come in with Control and clean up the edges so that I can really get really fine control over this. Okay, let's come in with a grab. I kind of want to pull these jowls out to make sure I'm maintaining sort of a square, blocky form. So I'm going to press Alt and M to clear my mask and take a look at it without any sort of distracting color variations here. I'm going to pull out these cheekbones a little bit wider. Maybe not that much. Okay, so I like the sort of angles of the mouth in the reference here, and I don't have that extreme of an angle going on, so I'm going to try to replicate that. I'm going to come in with the grab brush and just push up the center, pull down these sides to give it a frownier expression. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, I've lost some definition in my mouth here, so I'm going to come in with the crease brush again. And just reshape these lines. And I'm also going to come in with the draw brush, I think, and sort of pull out more of a definition on this bottom lip. That looks pretty good, even from the side. This could probably stand to come forward a little, but I'm gonna use a mask first so I don't mess up everything that I just carefully put there. I'm gonna mask out those areas. I'm gonna grab the grab brush and I'm just gonna pull this sort of septum forward. It's a little bit flatter because the face is quite flat here. Again, not going for like a one-to-one or anything, but you know, I do not want to deviate too far from my reference. So I think this form is a little bit strange on the cheek here, so I'm gonna use the grab brush to push that in. Okay. Obviously there needs to be a lot more work around the back of the head and around the top here. But the face itself is shaping up really well. So I'm actually just gonna mask the whole thing out so I don't mess it up. I'm increasing my strength of my masking brush with Shift and F. There we go. So now I can come in here and start to work on the head and stuff and not have to worry about messing up anything on the face itself. Okay, so I'm going to come in with the crease. And just start creasing this line in. And also, oops, not that. I'm going to mask out the ear here so I don't lose definition in it. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the grab again, and I'm just going to start fixing some of this sort of weirdness, because it's sort of looking like a, I don't know, like a muffin or something, and that's not really what I want. So I'm just using a mixture of the grab and the and the smooth brush here. Then I also want to tighten up this line a little bit, but the way that I'm going to do that here is using the grab brush. I'm just going to start nudging this down again because I have all this masked out. So the area below it is not really going to move if I use the grab brush. I'm just going to mask out over here as well. Let's just mask out this entire line actually. And go back to our grab, increase our size here. And now I do believe that using the grab brush will not actually subdivide your mesh, even if you're using dynamic topology. So if you find that you're trying to grab something and there's just not enough geometry to work with, go over it really softly with the inflate brush first to subdivide your mesh, and then you should be able to grab the points that you need. There's a few brushes that will not subdivide, even if you're using it. Grab brush is one, and I believe the smooth brush will not subdivide your mesh. You have to subdivide it first using like either the grab or the draw brush, and then go over it with those other brushes. Just bring in the sides here a bit. It's looking a little dramatic. And I'm just gonna push this sort of down towards the bottom of the head to get this line a little bit sharper. And then we can pull the mass out here. And of course we can smooth it to sort of equalize it out. I'm gonna invert the mask with Control and I, which means I can now push this up. And you might get some masking artifacts. That's just sort of It's just sort of par for the course, unfortunately. You can come in and smooth them out and clear your mask and sort of try to equalize it out here. Okay, coming in with the crease, but we're gonna zoom in farther here. And I think we're just about ready to take this off of subdivide collapse. So what I'm going to do here is in the dynamic topology settings, the refine method is set to subdivide collapse, as I discussed earlier. I'm going to set it to subdivide, and that's going to allow me to get in and crease these really tightly without worrying about destroying the crease, because normally it would collapse these edges if they got too small to save on performance, but that's not really what I want in this case. So I would not be able to get in here and pinch this up really tight if I kept it on subdivide collapse. So I'm just going to use the grab brush to sort of fix that little pinching that I was starting to get. And in fact, if you want to pinch these edges tighter together without pushing the crease in farther, there is a brush for that. It is the pinch brush. So you can access it either here in the tool palette or by pressing P on your keyboard, P for pinch, obviously. And now when I come around this with the pinch brush, it will pinch these edges in together, but it's not actually pushing this crease farther into the mesh. So I like to come in with a crease brush first to make these lines and then really sharpen them up with the pinch brush. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about getting these lines perfect because we still have to retopologize this. And unfortunately, in the process of retopology, you will lose some of this detail. Again, this stage of sculpting is about getting our major forms in. And then we're going to retopologize, and then we're going to come back in and do some high-res sculpting. So refining this shape a little farther and then adding these sort of stone detail into the surface itself. Press M to get my mask here. I'm just going to mask out the top here. And I'm going to come in with my crease brush. And this isn't really in the reference, but I just want to crease a little bit for here to give it sort of a furrowed, angry brow appearance. And I'm just going to pull the center kind of and even this out with the grab brush again. I do want to add a little bit more detail around the eye because you can see here in the reference you have sort of the bags here that form around the socket. So let's put that in. We're going to use the crease brush again. I'm going to increase the size and I'm just going to go really lightly here. And in fact, it may be a good idea to mask out the eye itself before we start this so we don't get any mistakes or anything like that. So let's return to the crease brush and let's just draw out sort of that half circle here. And that's pretty good, but the angle is sort of funny, so I'm going to use my grab brush. I'm just going to come here and sort of fix it. Okay. Let's clear the mask and take a look. Coming in with a grab brush and fixing up sort of these lumps on the side. Again, it doesn't really have to be perfect at this stage. Okay, so I think for our basic shapes, this is actually pretty good. So we got a little bit of lumpiness in the back. Hang on, let's fix that first. So it's basically there though. So, and for the purposes of just for demonstration, I think this is a good place to stop. So when we come back, we're going to be re-topologizing this mesh so that we can prep it for even finer level detail sculpting. So I will see you in the next video.